selling other people's shit is cool because it's a great business. But when you do something that is yours and is with people and companies that you admire so much, like it doesn't get any better than that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Devers, and this is Clever. Today, I'm talking to Ben Clymer, founder and executive chairman of beloved watch site HODINKEE. Ben is widely considered to be a leading voice in the wristwatch industry. He's regularly quoted in major publications, including the New York Times, Reuters, Forbes, Departures, GQ, and the Financial Times, and was dubbed the High Priest of Horology by the New York Times in 2013. He has acted as a consultant and guest speaker for Apple, and was named to the Hypebeast 100 as one of the 100 most important influencers in global culture in both 2013 and 2014. Ben founded HODINKEE as a watch blog in 2008 to create a more welcoming space for people to talk watches, and has since grown the platform into a multi-channel destination for people to easily access the world of watches and horology, including print, digital, video and podcast content, an e-commerce platform, and services. He holds a master's in journalism from Columbia, and now can add watch designer to his resume as well, having recently designed a limited edition G-Shock in partnership with friend and longtime collaborator, musician John Mayer. As you'll hear, he's disarmingly candid with a refreshing perspective. So, no time like the present, here's Ben.
My name is Ben Clymer. I live in a place called Wacabuck, New York. I work in a place called New York, New York. And I'm the founder of a website called HODINKEE. And HODINKEE started out as a blog, like a literal blog in the 2008 terminology. And I started writing about watches because I loved watches. And I love beautiful things and I love telling stories. And now HODINKEE is the largest platform for watches in the world. We sell watches. We're an authorized dealer of 40 brands. We write about them. We design them. We create products and stories and narratives that we hope excite and educate and inform.
I love all of that. And we're going to have a good time talking all through it. So let's wind it all back to the early 80s. Born and raised in Brighton, New York, yes?
Brighton, New York, a suburb of Rochester. Probably the first time Brighton's ever been mentioned on any podcast of note. So was raised in upstate New York. Both of my parents were effectively public school teachers. So, I think that the first thing to note, and I think, frankly, a big part of the reason behind why HODINKEE worked and why I kind of work is that I wasn't raised in the context of air quotes, luxury at all. I can be very honest with you now and say I own a watch and a car that are worth more than the house I grew up in. And so, it really came, this idea of luxury and what I do now was really foreign to me. And so, growing up in that environment, I knew that like well-made things existed, but I seldom got to appreciate them or really understand them. And they weren't really part of my life at all growing up, except for when I would go visit my maternal grandfather down in Florida or here in the New York area. And he was a hero of mine because I just found him to be incredibly charming and incredibly interesting, and just not in like in like a hyper masculine way, but like a man that could kind of like handle things and like just wasn't afraid of things. Not that anybody else in my world really was, but he really lived life in a way that I really admired. He drove a Mercedes, which again was completely foreign in Rochester, New York to me. He wore a gold Rolex. He wore a Patek Philippe, which is a very high-end Swiss watch. And I was just fascinated by his lifestyle. I would say, frankly, more so than the lifestyle of my immediate family and certainly others in Rochester. And so when I was 16 years old, he gave me a watch, which was an Omega Speedmaster that I'm actually looking at. But it was in the back cover of Entrepreneur magazine some years ago, called The Gift of a Lifetime. And so he gave me this watch when I was 16, and it was probably a $1,000 watch at the time. But I mean, just a thing that was so far beyond comprehension for me as the financial value of it was extraordinary. For a 16-year-old kid, I was literally a pizza cook at the time. So a $1,000 watch was just crazy. But beyond that, like it was the first thing that I owned that had like material quality, and you can't see it here, but I'm kind of like rubbing my forefinger and thumb here because like it just felt different. I had many watches. I had Casios, which I referenced for the watch recently that I designed. I had Timexes, and I was into mechanical and analog things, but nothing felt like this.
Okay, I got to stop you because you've already told so much of your story, and I have all of these follow-up questions.
Okay, got it.
This is great. I have questions about your parents who were effectively public school teachers. And growing up in as you've said, a middle-class kind of environment, where was the priority placed? It wasn't on luxury things. Was it on academics? Was it on working hard? Was it on morals? What was it?
Yeah, I would say less so the latter. I mean, it was always a very moralistic life, but I mean, that wasn't, I would say, a priority. Yeah, I think it was really working hard and academics and just, I don't want to say just getting by, but like, there really wasn't this idea of like saying, hey, what do you dream of doing? What do you aspire to be? And maybe when I was a child, a young boy, maybe I wanted to be a baseball player or an astronaut. I frankly don't really remember, but it wasn't the type of really kind of dream focused environment where it really was saying, hey, do you want to be a painter someday? Do you want to be a writer someday? I think deep down, I wanted to be successful, whatever that meant. I wanted to be able to afford the things that I saw in my grandparents' life. But I think more than that, I wanted to be fulfilled and be in control of my own destiny. And I think what I really quickly ended up at, really in like my early 20s was I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be creative in some way.
Okay. So creativity comes in. Did you have any entrepreneurial role models or creative role models as a kid?
Yeah. I mean, my grandfather was an entrepreneur, so he was certainly the entrepreneur role model for sure. They were like kind of upstate New York, big shot guys, guys that like, wealthy friends, parents, things like that. But it wasn't like we were talking about Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. It wasn't something like that there was really like at a global level of, just kind of local entrepreneurs, small business owners. But from a design perspective, I mean, that was always a big part of our life in a very, very subtle way. And like in many ways, it kind of dissipated as we grew up, because I think, frankly, like just the realities of life, the money that my father would spend on beautiful things just went towards taking care of myself and my sister. And so again, you can't see it because this office is incredibly messy, but there's a Beogram 2000, which is a Bang & Olufsen turntable around the corner here, which was my father's turntable that he bought in the 1970s. So I mean, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Bang & Olufsen is a very high-end kind of design-centric Danish
Sure, yes,
stereo system. And so like him having Bang & Olufsen turntables in the 70s and then giving it to me, and I had it set up in my bedroom as a teenager, I think kind of says a lot about kind of the environment in which we lived. My grandfather always had Macintosh stereo systems. My mother's first car when she was in her 20s was a BMW 2002. And back then, BMW was not a luxury car at all. It was just European, and like imports didn't really exist at the time in the late 60s, early 70s. So there was always this kind of like thread of great design and products in the home, but it really started to fade away as my sister and I grew up, just simply because I would assume because of economic reasons. But we would always go back and look at these things that maintained in our house, like the Bang & Olufsen turntable.
Okay, so it's not that you spent a lot of money on precious objects, but occasionally they were acquired, they were kept, they were cared for. That's
exactly it. And, cameras, so I'm a photographer. We've since worked with Leica. My dad was a photographer. My grandfather was a photographer. So,
okay, there's the creativity.
Yeah. So I think like the thread of like archive is interesting because like these things were acquired, they were purchased before I was born in almost every single case. I have one recollection of my parents spending money on like material objects or just nice things. And that was when my father turned 50. They bought him a Rolex, and that's kind of it. But, there wasn't any excess money to spend on these things. And it just wasn't a priority. I think the priority was really on kind of getting by.
That makes a lot of sense to me. To fill out the picture a little bit, this grandfather that you admired that was kind of such a featured player in your early memories, were they snowbirds in Florida or did they grow up there?
So their parents immigrated when, around the First World War. So they were born in Brooklyn, lower income folks. They then kind of migrated just a little bit north into Queens, Long Island area. So they were basically New Yorkers. And then, when some success was achieved, they became snowbirds. So I kind of think of them as snowbirds.
Okay. And this $1,000 Omega Speedmaster, was this new, vintage?
So he bought it in the 90s when he was probably in his early 70s. He wore it for probably 5 years and then gave it to me. So he purchased it new, but it was worn. It was his.
Okay. This watch that he'd worn for 5 years. Talk to me about why it was so important to you. And was part of that the 5 years that it had spent on his wrist?
I think so. I mean, I think like those are the years when like, boys become men and, girls become women, blah, blah, blah. But like those were really formative years because, you're starting to get a sense of who you might be, or who I was getting a sense of who I might be down the road. And I went from being like incredibly shy, like painfully shy, to the point where like my parents were concerned about me socially. Like really, like I would cry at sleepovers, even with my best friends. I mean, it was really just didn't want to be around other people. to being incredibly sure of myself and frankly too sure of myself, like every young man is for a certain phase of life. But it was during that period that I began to have confidence in myself in a material way, where I thought, hey, I don't want to say play by the rules, but I don't have to do things the way that my parents want me to, do things the way that my teachers want me to, do things the way that my friends' parents told their children to behave. I could do things my own way. And I began to kind of skirt the rules a little bit in middle school and high school in terms of like attendance and sometimes skipping class here and there to go either, be with my then girlfriend or drive around town and listen to music. Like really, I wasn't getting up to anything, but just like normal adolescent stuff. But I realized that, I was able to kind of do that stuff and get by, and more than get by, succeed to some degree. I wasn't, valedictorian or anything like that, but I was doing okay in school. And I realized that there was a different way to kind of live your life.
Okay. So you're learning to dance.
Exactly.
And to lead your own part on the dance floor.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think those were the years when I spent the most time with my grandfather. And this is the watch he was wearing then. And he was more known within the family to wear this gold Rolex, like a day, which is like, kind of what you see in like the 1970s, kind of, gangster stuff. But like that wasn't the watch that really drew me to him. It was this Omega, which was something else entirely. It was much more understated, much more elegant, frankly, than a big gold Rolex. It was stainless steel. It had real purpose. It had functionality. And that watch really informed my own purview of design and certainly watchmaking for years to come. It still does.
Okay, we're going to pick that apart a little bit more. But you kind of touched on your teenage years as being transformational in that you were developing your own agency, like your own sort of navigation around the rules. How can I interpret the rules and do what I need to do to sort of spread my wings, but also still get by so that I'm not like foiling myself down the line. And that's kind of an important stage of life because that agency is, I guess, what I consider to be at the core of all of our creativity.
I think so.
And that agency, I think, will show up in your confidence in all areas of your life. So spending all this time with your grandfather during that time, in what ways did he impact and influence your agency or your willingness to reinterpret the rules that were being sort of shared with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I've never been asked this question, but I have like very clear memories of like, he belonged to a country club in Florida, like as kind of all elderly Jewish men do. And, the rules would be like, hey, you have to tee off from whatever, this set of tees. And he wouldn't say, fuck that, but he emotionally said, fuck that. Uh-huh. Like, we're just going to go do this. And I said, okay. And nothing happened. Right. I mean, there was no downside to playing from the blue tees instead of the white tees or whatever. And the way that he would treat a waiter or waitress, a host, a hostess, somebody selling him something, was just dramatically different than the way my parents interacted with people like that, or frankly, anybody else I knew interacted with them. It was much more, I'm going to say flirtatious, but it wasn't like romantic flirtation. It was more like an emotional kind of playful dance, to borrow a term from you, that like really felt engaging. And it was really binary. It was like the most charming thing somebody could possibly think of on the other end, or it was the most obnoxious thing somebody would think of. Mm-hmm. And there were times, and I have clear memories of both of those situations where like a waiter, a waitress would just, their pants were turned off of them and we got the table immediately instead of waiting for an hour or something. And then there were other situations where he would kind of pull his little shtick and the waiter or waitress or the host or hostess would just kind of say like, get out of here. Who do you think you are? And I think witnessing that taught me a lot about like, you can shoot your shot, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And if you get shot down, like, okay, like, he didn't like, his ego may have been bruised ever so slightly, but like he lived to fight another day and he continued his life. And I think, taking those shots on goal is what he probably taught me the most in those years.
Taking those shots on goal. I love that you distilled it down to that. How did he make his money? What was his entrepreneurial endeavor?
So, it was a different time. It was the 60s and 70s. He started a cigarette lighter business.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
It was a different time. I understand that.
Different time. Yeah. So he sold cigarette lighters basically in the 60s and 70s to, this wasn't Zippo or Bic or like, a name that you would know is called Flamex. But he ended up selling it for some amount of money. I don't think crazy amount, but something. And then he just had various other jobs, but like he was self-made. And that was the narrative. I don't smoke cigarettes. I never have. Obviously, I don't support them, but it wasn't about the cigarettes or the cigarette lighters. It was about that, like, he just did his own thing forever.
Yes. Okay. And so describe to me what is factoring into your decision to eventually go to Syracuse.
Yeah, that's frankly a very critical decision or turning point in my life, because I think, I'll be very transparent. I was disappointed that I didn't get into Wharton and Boston College and Cornell and like all the things that frankly I believed myself smart enough to do. And I think frankly those around me also believed that. And so I think, when I wasn't accepted into the Ivy League schools in high school, I kind of got the slap on the wrist. Not from my parents, but like I gave myself the slap on the wrist, because junior and senior year, as I said, very, very quiet, very insular, very nerdy guy. Junior and senior year, I really started to dick around.
Okay.
And so I started to drink and smoke and go out with girls and really just became extremely sure of myself, frankly, to an extreme degree. And because of that, my grades slipped considerably. And so when I didn't get into the schools that I deemed myself intelligent enough to get into, that hurt in a material way. And so I ended up getting a full scholarship to Syracuse. And I said, okay, like, well, it's not free, but tuition is covered. I'll do this and I'll work really hard and that's it. And so I think going to a school that...
Hey, wait a second. So you got an ego check at this point.
Yes.
And then you were self-aware enough to take that and to decide to turn it around. Instead of being defensive, mad, or, well, fuck this then.
Yeah.
You were actually like, no, okay, well, I still have an opportunity. Now I think I better just adjust, course correct.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know where I heard this line, but it still sticks with me to this day, which is like when I didn't get into Cornell, where all my friends got into, or Penn or whatever, somebody said to me like, real life is the great equalizer, and so like where you go to school, frankly, doesn't mean that much. And there are people that went to Harvard that now work for me. It means something, but it doesn't mean everything. But it was really like me kind of figuring out a way to validate myself to myself and maybe a little bit to the world, and to my parents and friends around me, that I wanted to succeed in a different way. And so at Syracuse, I found the first semester I did very well. I reapplied to Cornell. I got in. I chose not to go. I just said, I like my friends. I'm happy here, etc. So I stayed at Syracuse, and that was formative, definitely. It taught me that, like, look, I mean, there's like big fish in little pond syndrome, perhaps. And I think, frankly, like the experience at Syracuse was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because, again, I learned how to separate myself. Syracuse has, I don't know how many students, we'll say 10,000. Like, it's a sizable school. Mm-hmm. And, I was in this thing called the University 100, which was not necessarily like the best grades or the top 100 grades at the university, but kind of like the most promising. And so I found a way to really differentiate myself among the masses of students there. Again, it wasn't via just pure GPA. It was by doing things. It was by, instead of doing the study abroad program, with Syracuse and the other schools around them, I said, I'm going to apply to this thing at Oxford. I was the only student at Syracuse that even applied. I got in and lived at Oxford for an entire year.
And so is this also you sort of shooting your shot? And how much of this is charm? Have you started to polish your charm yet?
Yeah, I suppose. But I think, look, had I not gotten into the Oxford program, I would have just done the Syracuse program, and that would have been probably fine. But I just really wanted to differentiate myself, not because I felt it was better or worse. I felt different. And I think this idea of feeling different is kind of super salient, because I felt it all along and I continue to feel it. Even if I didn't feel different, I wanted to be different.
So Syracuse, you differentiated yourself among the masses. And that sounds really formative to me in terms of you also like claiming your agency and how you navigate the world, how you show up for yourself and others. After Syracuse, what did you study at Syracuse?
So business, like, kind of like top level business, because I was in this like independent study program, and then like basically computer science, like information studies. So like basically, like I was always a tech guy. Like I built my own website when I was 15, like coded it in HTML, and then business. So which obviously lent itself very well to what I do now. Like I coded the first version of HODINKEE myself, and I designed it, and I wrote it, and I took all the pictures. It was a blog. So that's what I studied there.
Okay, so we have a couple of years before HODINKEE. Talk to me about that transition.
Yeah, so a lot of my friends ended up taking jobs at like KPMG, the big four accounting firms, which like to me, even then I knew it was just like, that was so fucking wrong for me. Like it wasn't even funny. Mm-hmm. So I ended up applying. I was in this This is like the dorkiest thing I've ever said, I think. But I was in this business fraternity called the Delta Sigma Pi fraternity. And via that, I got connected to a gentleman who worked at a small boutique consulting agency in Tribeca called Aquis Consulting Group, which was a really neat firm and with like cool offices, and like everyone was like kind of attractive and went to all the Ivy League schools. And like it was like the kind of place that like I like dreamed of working. Somehow got a job there. That was kind of like, okay, like everything I did at Syracuse was right to get me into this program. And so I remember the only other person that was hired in kind of like this incoming class at this consulting group went to Wharton. And I was like, okay, like I did it. Like I can kind of be on the same playing field as these guys now.
And for you, what did that mean? Was that about status or excellence?
I think opportunity. Yeah. I mean, I think like I was quite sure that like this was going to be the first job of a few. It wasn't like I saw myself staying there forever. It was about opportunity to be around like meaningfully intelligent thinkers. Mm-hmm. Not that they didn't exist at Syracuse. They did. They certainly did at Oxford. They did in my high school. But to be around that in a professional environment.
Yeah.
And it was cool. And, you know, cool in like the early 2000s sense when like working at Goldman Sachs was like the coolest thing on earth, you know, which like now it's not. And I love Goldman Sachs. Sorry, guys. But it's not that cool anymore, you know. You know, like finance in New York was a thing 20 years ago. Everybody wanted to work at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or whatever. And so, you know, my consulting company had big clients. And like one of our clients was Pfizer. And Pfizer had a drug called Lipitor, which was literally the most valuable drug on earth. It's the cholesterol drug. And it went off patent in one of the years that we were there. And so I forget the number, but it was like Lipitor represented like, I'm gonna say this since I think it's correct, like a $20 billion a year piece of revenue for Pfizer. I mean, just like wow. Enormous, capacious, you know, like it's literally the most valuable drug in history. And it went off patent. And that means you can make generics. Like all of a sudden, you can get Lipitor for 10 cents on the dollar versus Lipitor. And one of the projects we had was like just kind of being around to like think about that for Pfizer. And it's like, I'm not a sports guy, but like, how do you replace Michael Jordan? Like you don't, right? Like you can find somebody that is pretty good, but like there's not going to be another Michael Jordan and there's not going to be another Lipitor. You know, and this was also during the years when Viagra became a thing. Mm-hmm. You know, Viagra is like, again, now there's generics of that. But back then it's like, this is the only erectile pill on the market. Like this is a massively valuable thing. I mean, it was like, I don't know if you remember, there was like 60-minute segments on Viagra and what it would mean for the future of mankind. I mean, it was just a crazy thing. And so we were there during the period that Viagra became a thing, like literally the first year. And also the year that Lipitor went off patent. Again, like I was a kid, I didn't know anything, but to be in the room with my bosses and the people at Pfizer to talk about those two things in particular. And there was some kind of like moral discussions around Viagra in particular. And it was just a wild experience as a very young person to just, again, I was not part of the conversation. I was just in the room. And that was pretty weird and pretty formative.
What did you take away from that environment in terms of, I guess, responsibility and also witnessing that? I can imagine you wouldn't want to go back to being in a place where you didn't have access.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But I think that, I'll just be honest, the biggest takeaway from me was that a lot of these guys were not that smart. You know, like you
yeah. No, I've been in there too. Like, wait a second, there's so much failing upward in this industry. How did you get here?
Right. And in real life. And I think, you know, and it was not the CEO of Pfizer at all. That guy was actually incredibly intelligent. But like, you know, the people around, like the C-suite of Pfizer and the consulting agency that I was with and other people that were there were a lot of incredibly intelligent, thoughtful, kind, considerate people. And then there's a bunch of fucking idiots. Like, you know, people that just like really like, again, like, how did you get here? How is this in your hands? And that kind of really just compounded the belief that I had from Syracuse and slightly before, which was that like, if not me, then who? Why not take the shot? And I really saw it there at the consulting company. And again, some of them brilliant, absolutely, like still in consulting, amazing. And others of them were really not. But it also just made me think like, hey, like I can do this. And that just allowed me to have more, I wouldn't say self-confidence because I wasn't sure that I could do anything, but I just was propped up by this idea that like I could take the shot. And if I failed, I would just continue my life and so be it, you know, and the confidence to do that.
So that lasted for how long? And then get me to the origin story of HODINKEE. And along the way, what's your relationship to watches or objects of value this whole time?
So while I was at the consulting company, I met a beautiful, intelligent woman. It was one of those moments where I just like, I couldn't believe that she liked me back. That again really empowered me in a way that was as meaningful as any academic or professional experience. Like, this woman was so beautiful and so funny and so smart, and like, she's the kind of woman that would just light up a room. And again, I remember thinking to myself sometimes, like, how did this happen? Like, how did I get here?
Mhm.
For the record, my wife is not that woman, but just like that. I mean, the exact type of just glow around her. And it really gave me the self-confidence, not as a professional, but as just a person, to believe in myself, that like, if this woman cared enough about me to spend her time with me, then okay, I could try some other stuff. But I left the consulting company around the same time she did. She wanted to go back to school to become a biomechanical engineer of all things. And I was like, if you're going to leave, I'm going to leave too. I'm going to start a company. So I left the consulting company to start what was, I think in hindsight, a terrible idea, but certainly not the idea that we're here to talk about, which was like a social network for like real estate. So I tried to start this company. It went nowhere. And then effectively, one of the partners at the consulting company had jumped over to UBS, the big bank. And he said, hey, you're a smart guy. I've got a job here for you. And so I was 25 and went to UBS to work as basically a project manager. And they offered me a salary of $100,000 a year, which, like, at the age of 24, 25, growing up in Rochester, New York, I mean, that is just unheard of, you know? So did that, hated it. It was certainly empowering, but the work itself was this was working internally for UBS, which is just a giant Swiss bank. And it was also the same year, 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, which, you know, again, was like a financial earthquake for many. And the way that the bank treated long-term employees really disturbed me, just as like a human being.
It's hard to stick around when you see people being mistreated.
Yeah. And so, you know, I basically stopped working because A, the group didn't have a lot of work, and B, I was just so turned off by all this. It was one of those situations where it was kind of like a voluntary departure. Had I not volunteered, I would have been laid off for sure. And I didn't care. That was another big moment for me, where HODINKEE was already a thing at that point. It was already me. I was blogging every day about watches. And I just didn't care because I had something I did care about. What my parents cared about at the time was if I had health insurance.
Right. Yes. Mine too.
Yeah, you get it. And I didn't, to be clear. But I knew that I could get another shitty job at a bank if I had to. But I had this blog that I'd started a few months earlier at UBS about watches that people started to really like. I started to get asked to freelance for places like GQ, for the Financial Times, for real publications, not your local college newspaper, but like meaningful titles. That gave me the confidence to become like a real journalist, to become a real writer. And I ended up applying to journalism school. And that's when I left.
So you went to Columbia for your master's in journalism, but the difference between journalism and the guy who wanted to start a real estate social network.
Yeah.
That seems like a leap to me.
It is. But I mean, like, we're all so many people.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the dumbest and smartest thing somebody once said to me was that people are complex, and like, they really are. And I'm included in that. And I think I can be like a hyper emotional, sentimental, thoughtful person, and I can be the guy that just wants the cool car or the cool watch. And like, I'm the same person, and that's okay. You know, two things can be true at once.
Yeah. And I think it's very telling that you didn't try very hard actually on the real estate thing. And then you started this blog about watches, and now you want to go to school to become a journalist, which is also not real estate development, like in terms of salary potential.
It's sure not. it's really not. Yeah. But I was, look, it was also one of those like self-fulfillment things where I'd always deemed myself creative and deemed myself like a good writer. But frankly, nobody else had, you know, or nobody else even considered me in that light. And I was like, I got to tick the box for the Ivy League thing, which I didn't get to do in undergrad, which is a thing, as silly as it sounds. And on top of that, I got to try stuff that like, that was just so dramatically different than the world from which I came. Being a journalist is hard. It is meaningful work, and I have a lot of love for actual journalists, not the me's, but the real journalists out there. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredibly wonderful experience for me. But again, I kind of, you know, I'm still a writer to this day, but not in the traditional kind of journalism sense.
I can imagine that HODINKEE was also very satisfying to you in terms of uniting with other watch lovers, but also just being in communication and having a means, a vehicle, an architecture through which that happens.
It was incredible. I mean, it was beyond incredible. You know, as somebody who always felt different, it was a way to feel united and empowered and supported. And for the first time in like a dramatic, meaningful way, I felt like a real leader. I was this leader of this like weird little movement of mechanical watches in the digital era. As stupid as and trite as it sounds, like I really was. And I think, if you go back to the 2008, 2010 area, like we began to share a narrative with the world via HODINKEE that was really different than the Robb Report, which I'm sure you've heard of, or even GQ or the New York Times. They would often say, here's the new Rolex, the price was $36,000. And that's kind of it. And I would be like, whoa. Like A, I can't afford it, so I don't care about the price. B, why is the Rolex Submariner, we'll say, or the Daytona, so interesting? Why is it $20,000? Why is it 10? And I would start to go into these auction houses in Manhattan. And I was actually doing this when I was at UBS. I would say I had a dentist appointment. I'd go to auctions instead. And I would read about these things and say, well, wait a minute, like Paul Newman wore this Rolex Daytona. Why would Paul Newman, one of the most famous, handsome, successful people on earth, choose this watch over that watch? And the story of that became, frankly, seminal to my success, because we kind of put the Paul Newman Daytona on the map, which became the $18 million watch and kind of like really broke into the mainstream. But those stories ended up creating a whole new type of consumer that was younger, that was more context driven than commerce driven. It was more like, hey, why this Rolex? You end up at the same place. You get the guys that I probably used to work with in finance saying, I want the Rolex because it might tell the chick at the bar that I'm rich or whatever, or because my dad had one. And then you get the HODINKEE guys, which is like, you end up at the Rolex because they created the waterproof watch, or they created the first self-winding watch, which they did. They invented things. They did things that they didn't have to do. And I think that's really beautiful. So you end up in the same place, but you get there for very, really different reasons.
Yeah. I'm just trying to relate back to my life. And the thing I keep thinking of is like record collecting. So much of it is about the context that you've dug into, like what you appreciate and value about that record, that artist, and how and why they created it, and the story that goes into it. And a lot of times you want to keep it, even if it's not your favorite record, you want to keep it because it's a point of reference. It's more contextual information against which everything else is weighed. And so I can see that you end up at the same place, but at this point, it's not that the desire to prove your status got you there. It was the desire to understand and choose which route is meaningful to you to get you there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, Ralph Lauren, who's another hero of mine, and kind of any young white man that deems himself stylish has to admire Ralph Lauren, And he famously, he came from the Bronx, as you may know, with very little money. And his taste, he said, was basically harnessed and built because he couldn't afford all the ties. He could afford one tie. And so he wanted to make the best tie. And now he makes lots of ties, obviously. Yeah. But I think it was very much the same thinking that allowed me to really kind of create my own version of taste. I couldn't afford a single watch. The one that my grandfather gave me, but I wanted to know what watches were the most interesting. I couldn't compete with the rich banker guys that had the $100,000 watch. I couldn't have the most expensive, but I could have the most interesting.
So there's many people in my life who I would call crate diggers. And I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing skill. They know what they're looking for. They can rifle through all of the, sort of stuff and zero in. As you're creating this business and this means of communication, and you're not necessarily buying the watches for yourself, is it about the deep dive? Is it about the obsession with the aspirational quality?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, describe to me the flavor of your obsession here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very honest, and I think until really through Columbia, so 4 years of HODINKEE, which is a pretty long time, it was completely self-centered. It was really like, hey, what do I find interesting? What do I want to write about? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm going to do. Once we started getting advertising, then then there's informative inputs here and there, we should say.
Sure.
But the formative years of HODINKEE were driven by my interest in what I found interesting and the stories that I thought would be the most shared and the most kind of compelling to other people. And I think, going back to the very first part of the conversation, I think what really made HODINKEE and me so different was that what I now call middle-class mindset. Mm-hmm. It sounds silly now, and it is silly, but even though we were online writing about watches, it wasn't about the money. It really wasn't. It was the idea of luxury to me, I kind of bristle at. It was about the stories. It was about the craftsmanship, and the way even a Rolex is made is incredible. If you could see the way these things are made, I mean, it would blow your mind. And there's not a single person that could go to any great Swiss manufacturer and see how any high-end watch is made and not at least be impressed and say, you know what? Okay, I understand why it's $5,000. Like, I get it now. And it's not to say you're going to buy it, but you would at least get it. And that was what was most compelling. So I was just doing what I wanted to do. And with that came photography. I designed the website, the logo, the name, the everything. I took all the photos myself. I edited all the photos myself. I self-published. And at the time, I met a guy named Gene Stone, who's a very well-known author. He's got a few large titles to his name, but he's actually, like 10 years ago, was the ghostwriter. Mm-hmm. He wrote the autobiographies for some like the most well-known people in the world. And I was in Colombia and we started chatting, and I produced a story that I filmed myself, I edited myself, I photographed myself, and I published myself. And he's just like, I just remember talking to him. He's like, this is fucking crazy. Like, you do all this stuff yourself? And I was like, yeah, like, why not? You know? And he said, well, like, when I write a book, there's me, there's the subject, there's 4 editors, there's the publisher. And he's just like, you're doing all the stuff for yourself. And I said, yeah. And I didn't think anything of it. And so it was in that odd period of when media was, so I said working in finance was, you know, kind of the dream for many people. The other dream in New York was working for Condé Nast or Hearst. Mm-hmm. They were the end game. You know, Anna Wintour was queen, and Bob Sauerberg, who was the CEO of Condé Nast, was like the most powerful man in New York. And they took town cars everywhere, and they ate at the Lambs Club. And it was like this very chic, expense account driven environment. But it was at the time when those facades started to crack a little bit. And people started to see that, like, hey, media is kind of hard, or like, you know, you can't just keep like people spending money on ads that don't actually drive any conversion. Like, that's just not going to last forever. And so media started to change. And that's when we started to go into commerce, and we went into commerce very early.
Yeah. When did you go into commerce?
2012. So we started making straps, like leather watch straps, in Italy in 2012. We put them online. We were one of the first 2,000 Shopify accounts, which is pretty early.
Yeah.
Shopify now we're billions of dollars, you know, wish we had invested then. But we started selling things online, the HODINKEE shop, shop.hodinkee.com. And we did a collection of straps, and we sold out immediately. It was on the front page of every men's magazine, GQ, Esquire, whatever. And it was that day that I got an email from a guy named John Mayer, the singer.
Oh, just him.
Yeah, just him. And he said, hey, John Mayer here, big fan, would love to catch up. I thought it was a joke, obviously. Hopped on the phone. It was, in fact, John Mayer. And we became fast friends. And, you know, he was into watches before I was. He certainly had a lot more money than I did, and still does. But, you know, he was just fascinated by this idea of like a young guy in this space. And also I had nothing to sell him. And I think as like a young guy in Hollywood that with some money, you know, I think he was the target of a lot of guys trying to take advantage of him. And I had nothing to sell him, you know. So we became real friends really fast. You
were just fellow watch nerds.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
So you became fast friends, and then that's led to both media collaborations and actual watch design collaborations.
Yep. So he started writing for us for free in 2013. We started doing videos together just for fun in 2013 or so. We still work together. I mean, we did a collaboration as recently as a few weeks ago with my G-Shock. You know, he's an incredibly thoughtful, design-centric guy. But, you know, his decision to kind of back me as a person was another one of those moments where it's like, okay, like this guy doesn't need to do this at all. In fact, quite the opposite. And he's choosing to. And that was one moment that really, again, kind of like allowed me to have more confidence in myself. There was another in that somebody decided to make an offer to buy HODINKEE. It was a 3-person company. And they said, we want to own this thing. And I said, holy shit, like, why? You know, and that was a big deal. And then shortly thereafter, I gave a talk at the Apple store in Soho. And a young man came up to me and he said, hey, I just want to let you know, I love HODINKEE. I found out about it from Steve Jobs. And yeah. And I was just like, oh, what? Okay. And I was like, yeah, exactly. And I was like, what do you even mean by that? You know, he was a guy a little bit younger than me. He had at one point fairly advanced cancer. And his make-a-wish was to meet Steve Jobs. And so Steve Jobs agreed and went to his hospital bed, and they became friends. And one day Steve Jobs said, hey, check out this blog. It's called HODINKEE. I think it's pretty cool. That was obviously a mind-blowing experience. And then that led to the relationship with Apple, which is still a good one.
Wow. So I can hear how the business is evolving. You had your ear to the ground and you were not in any way under any illusions. When you got into e-commerce in 2012, that was a pretty important move.
Yeah.
Since then, you chose not to sell when you got the offer. Was that it, like doubling down on yourself, kind of believing in what you had?
Exactly that. And I had become friends with actually a contemporary of Steve Jobs, a guy named Tony Fadell.
Yeah.
who was part of the founding team of the iPod and iPhone. He then sold Nest to Google for like some $1 billion number. And I host this video series called Talking Watches, where it's like insert famous person. And Tony did one early on. And he was obviously dramatically more successful, but we became friends. And he was, frankly, my mentor during all this. And he said, do not sell this business. Like, to be clear, the dollar amount was insane. It was like, 7 figures, which, again, from Rochester, New York, like unheard of. But he said, don't do this. This business is special. Trust me on that. Let me help you raise money. So instead of selling it, we doubled down on myself and raised capital. Tony invested, John Mayer invested, some other very smart people invested as well. And we went out to build a real business. And so we went from being a 3 or 4 person company to about a 13-person company, basically overnight, and then a 20-person company, and so on and so forth. And then in 2017, we became the first authorized dealer of watches on the internet, period, in any language, in any market. And that was kind of another really big turning point for us.
Yeah, that's amazing. And congratulations to you on sort of breaking that ground. I think when you start as a blogger and you end up kind of changing the landscape, that's worth calling out.
I very much appreciate that, because not often does that get called out. But I think along the way, we changed how people look at watches for sure. We made it much more accessible, much more fun, dynamic, etc. But I think the thing, and maybe kind of bring it back to this podcast in particular, is like we started to make our own things. And I think that was, in many ways the most satisfying for me, because selling other people's shit is cool because it's a great business and we can do it in a totally new way. And like the innovation behind that is material. And I was really proud of that. But when you do something that is yours and it doesn't have, in most cases, didn't have my name on it, but it had the HODINKEE name on it, was pretty nutty. And so, we started designing watches in 2016 or so. This is after the straps and accessories with great brands. I mean, some brands you would know, some you wouldn't, but we've since ended up working with Hermes twice. We've worked with Leica twice. We've worked with a company called Vacheron Constantin, which is like, one of the most prestigious brands in the world. Omega, which is the second biggest brand in the world behind Rolex. I would say, frankly, iconic products.
Sure.
That exist with their name on it. So there are watches that say Hermes and HODINKEE on them. There's a color called HODINKEE Blue in the Hermes archive. So working on those things has been incredibly satisfying. And if my office were set up, and I apologize that it's not, you'd be able to see, because they were in my old office, like we have the design documents of all the iterations of the first Hermes watch. And we work with Swatch, which is a hugely important company in our category. We never did a collaboration with Apple, but I was involved with the creation of the Apple Watch with Johnny Ive, who remains a friend. And it's pretty amazing. Like those are the things that are kind of the most exciting to me, because I'm a very tactile person and a design guy. And so to make beautiful things with people and companies that you admire so much, like it doesn't get any better than that as far as I'm concerned.
So we're talking about watches as objects, but they're really stand-ins for time and how we mark time, value time. And so underneath it all, I really just want to understand what your relationship to time is.
The watch for me is an exceptional object. You use the watch that I'm wearing, which is actually the watch I was kind of making fun of my grandfather for wearing. This is a day date. This one's in platinum instead of gold. It is a very old man watch. It's not cool at all. But this one is a riff on the watch my grandfather wore. This watch was given to me by my wife for my 40th birthday. It's engraved on the back with her handwriting. And on a random Tuesday in my office, like this is what I choose to put on, because frankly, it's got my wife's handwriting on the back. And so this is the type of thing where now I've got 2 very young children. I think about the objects, and some of them I contributed to, some of them I did not, that I want to be the talismans for the relationship that I have with my own life. And this watch in particular is extremely understated. If you saw it, you would think it's nothing, and it is nothing. But it's platinum. It's a Rolex. It has real meaning to me. Rolex is kind of the king of the watch world, so to speak. And I choose this watch more times than not because of what it means to me and what it means to my family and what I hope it means to my future children. My relationship with time has changed a lot. I went from being remarkably self-centered recently, even, and really driven on validating myself to the world. And even when I do podcasts such as this, or even when I basically do anything in the greater world, I'm always like, oh man, like I'm just like this watch nerd, like they don't take me seriously. Or I should say I used to feel that way. And then more recently, as things have continued to go well, I wouldn't say I stopped caring, but I view myself differently as like, I don't consider myself a watch expert, which I am. I know more about watches than just about anybody I know, but I view myself as more of an entrepreneur and a creative and as an independent thinker than I ever did before. And I think the things that were most challenging for me were those years when we had celebrities writing for us and Google Ventures was an investor, which is, Google's investment arm, which is pretty prestigious. And we had all these like things, but I always felt like I had to like revalidate myself every 2 weeks or every 2 months or whatever. Mm-hmm. And now I don't feel that anymore. And so my time now is dedicated mostly to my family, certainly to HODINKEE, and I've got another startup in the digital golf space. But, my time now is dedicated to self-fulfillment and ensuring that my family is in the best position possible.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I think a lot of listeners, I think everybody can relate to this period in our lives where we're driven by validating ourselves.
Yeah.
And when you reprioritize because of family or wisdom or whatever, it can be liberating.
And how? I mean, to say the least, yeah.
Yeah. So understanding that about you and your relationship to time, how does that play into your overall creative process now that you are actually a watch designer as well as a designer of your own business and of your own life?
I have the great luck and the great benefit of being the emotional leader of a company that has good repute. I'm not the actual leader. I'm not the CEO. I stepped down over 3 years ago willingly, like more than willingly. That was the best thing that I ever did. I had accomplished what I needed to accomplish to feel good about myself as a leader. I accomplished what I needed to accomplish in terms of having money in the bank to ensure security for my future family and myself. And I said, you know what? Like now I want to do the things that fulfill me. And that's where I am now. I continue to support HODINKEE and continue to support many things as any good founder or employee should. But my primary goal now is ensuring my family and my next 40 years, I'm 41, are fulfilling for me. And I think, if I actually said this, I was having dinner with somebody that I know, but not super well over the weekend in Colorado. She basically asked, like, now that you're not the CEO of HODINKEE anymore, like, what are you looking to accomplish? And I said, realistically, like, I'm good. If I retired tomorrow, I could look anybody in the eye, including, somewhat famous entrepreneur, billionaire guy, and feel really good about the contributions I've made. And feel really good about all the work that I've done. I've done it earnestly and I've worked really hard and I've built businesses and I've helped people along the way. That's not to say I want to stop, but I could stop. And so now my priorities have changed dramatically, which is, I think, normal and healthy. Because as I said, up until very recently, up until, frankly, I got together with my wife, Cara, my priorities were totally out of whack. It was all about me. It was all about the business. It was all about HODINKEE. It was all about continuing to grow and make money and buy watches and stupid shit. And now it's not. I still do that. I love doing that. I bought a watch this week, but that's not what drives me anymore. And so I'm in a much healthier, friendlier environment that makes me proud. That makes me feel, really good about this journey. I often think that like, I've done a lot of work on myself, as you may or may not, kind of sense from this conversation. But I often think about, had HODINKEE not worked, or had I made some fatal mistake, or had I not taken that swing or shot on goal, as I said earlier, there's a version of me where I would be potentially really unhappy, maybe depressed. If I was still working in finance and I am who I am now and have some version of the beliefs that I have in myself, but I didn't have the great fortune to have my own office in upstate New York and have a company in New York City and et cetera, I might be pretty unhappy. And I think like that is, kind of a great plague of many men and women in, kind of the upper middle class world or just generally. And so, again, I feel very fortunate and very lucky, and I'm fully sated. I feel totally satisfied with kind of where I am in life. That's not to say I'm still not hungry and don't want to try other things, but I feel really good about where things are right.
That's great to hear. I think that's also guessing, but I'm thinking as a father, that's probably a pretty good place to be, especially since your kids are also probably going to figure out their own interpretation of the rules and how to do the dance, lead the dance on the dance floor.
That's exactly right.
You made it sound pretty rosy. And at the same time, I know in any sort of life, that's not a full spectrum picture. There are always growth edges and fears that must be confronted. As someone who's done a lot of work on yourself, I can only imagine you're still doing that work. What does it look like at this particular time?
I mean, there's so many things that I could share. Some of them you would be shocked at. I don't look like John Mayer, who's 6'5" and very handsome and can slam a guitar and like has played with the Rolling Stones, right? Like he's very clearly an outlier. I don't look like Michael Jordan. I don't look like Steve Jobs. So I think in many ways, I think my relatability and like my kind of like generic white guy dorkiness works for me and against me. It works for me in that like I'm extremely relatable. People can understand that like, hey, like we want this guy to win because he's just like us. Like I didn't have a silver spoon. I'm not a trust fund kid. I assure you of that. And I think that story really resonates profoundly with a lot of people. But I think sometimes you get people that are generally unhappy with their own situation and say, well, fuck this guy. Why does he get to be the guy that designed his own G-Shock? Or why does he get to be the guy that's on camera with whoever, Adam Levine or Aziz Ansari or something? And so there has been a lot of hate. I mean, really like vitriolic hate towards me from the community. And I think if you get into any community, and I'm talking small, like niche community, whether it's design, records, I'm sure this exists, I'm sure of it. Any collectible, there's these guys that become kind of like the Pied Piper of that world. And for better or worse, I'm one of the Pied Pipers of watches, And if you like my aesthetic and if you like what I contribute, then great. If you don't, then they have real issues with me. And people have come after me personally about whatever. I mean, insert, whether it could be my looks, my weight, my intelligence, my sensibilities. I mean, you name it. And it's shocking to me that people, would go that far over. Like I literally just talk about watches, right? I'm not running for president.
Yeah.
It kind of says more about them than it does me. But that is a really trying, really difficult thing. And like as I said earlier, like I was painfully shy, and I am a true introvert. Even though I've been very chatty in this conversation, I'm a true introvert. Like I don't want the attention at all. I love the acclaim, just like anybody would, but like I don't want the attention. So when people that have never met me come after me with vitriol, I mean, just imagine how weird and unsettling that would be for me. And it is, to this day. Less so because I'm used to it now. But in the early days of Instagram, when people would just like, make meme posts about me and like, it was really just toxic stuff. And so I removed myself from Instagram for over 3 years.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. That sounds like a healthy detox, hopefully.
Sure was. It was, there was a lot of stuff going on in my life behind the scenes that also kind of necessitated just like more mental clarity and emotional clarity. So 2018 to 2021, 3 full years, I wasn't on it at all. Didn't look at it, didn't have a Finsta or anything like that. And then came back when I felt good enough that I could handle it. And now people can say whatever they want about me and I just don't care.
Well, congratulations on that. That's actually a huge place to get to.
Thanks.
That's huge.
Thank you.
It's a big deal. All right. I have loved hearing your story. Thank you so much. I think you've been enormously creative in the way that you've navigated your life and your business and your relationship with objects and time and luxury. And it's really interesting to hear you unpack it all for me. And I do want to just really acknowledge that at some point you said the watches were a talisman of your life, and that you anticipate those being transferred down to your children and your grandchildren.
Absolutely.
And that connection, that emotional connection that we have with objects is at the heart of these important pieces that we celebrate and hold precious in our life, that then continues to speak for us after we're gone. They hold our memories, they're vessels of meaning.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why design is so important as a process, as a field, as an industry, as a way of understanding the objects that we hold dear.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, HODINKEE and what you stand for is representative of that.
Yeah, you're totally right. And you couldn't be more right, frankly. And it's about permanence. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in a new office this is basically my first or second day, so nothing is set up. But the one thing that's by my desk is this, which is the picture of, this is from Entrepreneur Magazine, a picture of the watch that my grandfather gave me. I don't even have a picture of him here. Right now I have a picture of this, And so, at a certain point, a guy named Elliot Friedman bought this watch in the 90s, and now it's here next to me. He's been gone for, as I said, 15 years. But like the one thing that's sitting next to my desk as I unpack is that, and it'll always be there. And I think that is, it's just so permanent. And the watch itself, which is at home, my daughter who's 2, my son who's 10 months, they will get that someday.
Yeah.
And I think, they will have never met this man, but, this man is always there. And I think that, again, the reason that I'm wearing the watch that my wife gave me today is because I want to feel the connection to them more than anything else. And so I'm not at home. I'm at my office. I want a piece of them with me all the time. And yeah, watches do that in an amazing way. I mean, this watch will be around forever. I mean, I own watches from the 1700s, right? And like the person who made that thing is long gone. The person who bought that thing is long gone, but the watch is still there. And that's a really beautiful thing about them.
Well, that is really beautiful about you. So thank you so much for sharing your story. This has been so delightful for me. And thanks for being you. And fuck those bullies. Fuck all of them.
That's what I'm saying. No, this was truly a treat. And I mean, thank you so much. And you're a great interviewer. I mean, like really, this is one of the best I've ever done. So thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. For a transcript of this episode and more about Ben, including links and images, head to our website, cleverpodcast.com. While you're there, check out our resources page for books, info, and special offers from our guests, partners, and sponsors. And sign up for our free Substack newsletter, which includes news, announcements, and bonus content. If you like Clever, there are a number of ways you can support us. Share Clever with your friends, leave us a 5-star rating or a kind review, support our sponsors, and hit the follow or subscribe button in your podcast app so that our new episodes will turn up in your feed. We love to hear from you on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X. You can find us at Clever Podcast, and you can find me at Amy Devers. Clever is hosted and produced by me, Amy Devers, with editing by Mark Zurowinski, production assistance from Ilana Nevins and Anushka Stefan, and music by L1011. Clever is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Visit surroundpodcasts.com to discover more of the architecture and design industry's premier shows.
Love HODINKEE. I found out about it from Steve Jobs.